And with Deputy Tadier, we were at the scrutiny hearing, the first of the new season earlier on. They were looking at aspects of they call it caring for children, or children in care. What did you make of the whole meeting?
The meeting was quite interesting, actually. I was impressed by some of the members on the scrutiny panel, and considering it's probably their first, or one of their first hearings, one of their quarterly public meetings with the Minister, I thought they generally did quite well. I was less impressed with the ministerial team and the part that they had to play, let's say. And just for the record, it's very interesting to note that there were no accredited media there. The JEP didn't have even one journalist. Channel Television were nowhere to be seen, and the radio were nowhere to be seen. Thankfully there were bloggers there. We had obviously yourself, another well-known blogger in Jersey, and I turned up just to take some notes, which I, partly for personal reference, which may also transpire into a blog. Now, I mention that for a specific reason, because actually we've had specific comment from the media early on in the week. We had the JEP leading with reports about foster children, that there aren't enough foster carers due to the economic downturn. It's difficult for families who are often working two jobs to encourage them to foster or adopt. They're quite happy to run with that story, which is no doubt the result of a press release. But when the follow-up comes for the Minister to be interviewed publicly by the scrutiny panel, they're not there. So that it doesn't really add up. We had also that coincided with the Inspectorate's reports findings this week, which were broadcast quite comprehensively in the media. But again, none of the media were there to actually follow up, apart from the unaccredited media. It
was interesting that there was a minister, two assistant ministers and 2 or 3 officers from the health department there, an awful lot of person power. But what was also very interesting was how little has been achieved in 3 years.
I think exactly. I mean, I was quite impressed by Deputy James Reid, who, you know, for the last 3 years has been on the other side of scrutiny, being on our old panel actually, and he asked some very pertinent questions. He said exactly that. He said between, I think, 2008, when Williamson made its recommendations, and 2011 last year, in the 3-year period, basically none of those recommendations, or rather none of the pertinent recommendations that we were talking about today, had actually been enacted. And he was asking, you know, why is that the case?
Of course, he had specific knowledge as the former Minister for Education. Children was very much his pet subject as an Education Minister, and having a specific role in the subjects they were talking today. So he was quite well briefed from his previous role, wasn't he?
That's right, yeah, I think so. And, you know, the fact that he's been on scrutiny previous to his position as Minister, I think also showed today.
It also, it wasn't evident that they'd rehearsed the questions and answers. Very often the scrutiny panels give the questions to the Minister and they just trot out their pet answers. It didn't seem to be that today.
No, it didn't. I mean, I think there's pros and cons for that. I think if you're looking for specific information, statistics, it's useful to give the questions in advance so you get accurate information. But you have to obviously, sometimes the element of surprise is good, because you don't want, as you suggest, ministers and often civil servants trotting out platitudes, because you want to get information off the hoof sometimes which is perhaps more, not necessarily accurate, but it tells more of a story than a well-rehearsed answer.
This was the first public hearing of the year. Now, of course, scrutiny has clamped down on public meetings, which is the usual ones. The hearings are the more unusual. That's when there is a witness, such as a minister. The meetings were extremely useful for members of the public, such as myself, trying to keep up to date and know what's going on. That facility is now removed from us. The public can't attend mere meetings. What do you make of that?
Well, I asked a question, and I know that's something you've been interested in previous blogs, because it seems to me that, okay, we can probably allow the new scrutiny members, you know, 1 or 2 months grace, because I think it's understandable, perhaps, if not inevitable, that they might want to get their feet under the table, make sure that they're fully conversant with you know, how the meetings work. But I think there's no reason why most times that when you set the agenda for your workload over the 3-year period, there's no reason that shouldn't be held in public, because it's of interest to the public. Public makes submissions. Often the public are making submissions publicly. They're not doing it necessarily confidentially. and the public have a right to know, I think, why their recommendations.
It was always said, as you were on scrutiny, wanting to engage with the public. Well, they're going in totally the opposite direction. They're absolutely not engaging with the public under the current system.
Yeah, I mean, the starting point for me is that unless a meeting absolutely needs to be held in confidence for whatever reason, then the starting point must be that it should be public. There are only certain conditions, if witnesses want to give evidence on very sensitive issues, of course that needs to be done confidentially. Perhaps question plans for ministers, you don't want to be giving the game away by allowing journalists and the public in necessarily, but anything else, I think,
Well, they used to have an A and a B part, and there was, in the years that I went, I never experienced any problems with there was nothing let out of the bag as far as I was aware.
Yeah. Well, let's say that I've spoken to the scrutiny chairman of all of the panels and suggested that actually in future they should hold as many of their meetings in public unless they've got a very good reason not to do so.
Christina Moore chaired today's meeting. I spoke to her separately about the lack of any questions, any reference to Convention on the Rights of the Child, absolutely central to this whole discussion about children's facilities in Jersey. Not a mention today, not from either side. What did you make of that?
I think that's because, as we know, there is a lack of knowledge of human rights arguments in Jersey and about the legislation and the conventions that go with that. But I think the people at the very top know exactly what ratifying these conventions entails, and they certainly don't want to do it because that would mean we'd be giving people rights in Jersey which they currently don't have, and it would be problematic to implement those.
Even rights that children should be listened to is obviously, that's one of the themes. Even now children are clearly not being listened to, and that has been such a dominant theme in the past few years, the abuse of children and the simple fact nobody listens to them. And that is, you would have thought that one message would have got through, wouldn't you?
Exactly, and that was picked up on by the chairman. Actually, she said in the context and with the background of what happened at Old Garin and subsequent cases of child abuse in Jersey, that actually that should be the first lesson which we should have learnt by now. You listen to children because they're your first whistleblowers, if you like. But let's get back to the fundamental point, is that we heard time and time again that there have been recommendations, reports, recommendations which haven't been implemented, and we were told today actually by the witnesses that it was due to a lack of funding often. Now the question wasn't asked why there was a lack of funding, even when actually money had perhaps been hallmarked, that money hadn't fully been given. Now who was making the decision to withhold the funds? Who was making the policy decisions to actually say we're not going to give you money for that because we're spending our public money here? The whole idea of perhaps the fact that we're underfunding the hospital, we're underfunding our children's services, and we have been doing so for decades. Of course it's a natural consequence that these kind of problems and reports which are critical of our service in various aspects are going to come up time and time again. So it actually boils down to finance. And
the fact that they've got yet another, today's scrutiny was consumed with attention to the report from a Scottish body which has looked at these facilities. The Scottish body seems to be doing the job of scrutiny. And which is the superfluous body here? Is it the Scottish body or scrutiny?
I don't think either are superfluous. I mean, I think both have different functions. You can't expect a scrutiny panel to necessarily have specialised specialist knowledge and the wherewithal to look at individual, not just departments, but individual parts of departments. So I think the two have different functions. Scrutiny is there to analyse policies, to make sure that recommendations from the reports, etc., are being implemented and that correct processes are being fulfilled. So I don't think they're mutually exclusive.
They were referring to reports. Some people will even remember the Cathy Bull report and the £4 million funding that was recommended then hasn't been done, hasn't been implemented. I mean, is there really any point in having such reports?
It's an interesting question because it's not limited to the health department. We have reports which are commissioned. Now who commissions the reports? It's the States of Jersey. So presumably there is a will to actually commission these to get to the root of problems. But of course commissioning the report is only the beginning. It's actually acting on the recommendations. Now, the interesting thing with the Cathy Ball report, and I don't know it inside out, but is that clearly the states recognise the need and the validity, I should say, of those recommendations, but somebody has turned around, now I'm presuming it's the Treasury Minister, has turned around and said, well, we don't have the funding available for this. And
but if these people we're listening to today were serious, they'd be challenging that, wouldn't they? They'd say, we've got a mandate to reform children's services. We need the budget. If these people, they were passing the parcel, weren't they? Whose responsibility? Oh, it's delegated to this assistant minister, but it's a team responsibility. It's not good enough, is it?
The teamwork thing is really interesting because, of course, the minister couldn't emphasise enough how she was a team player, and she looked to her assistant ministers to be the same. Presumably, the minister is also a team player when it comes to the Council of Ministers, and so one's in a delicate position. If you're a team player in the Council of Ministers, that suggests you sign up to their ideology, which is a low-spend ideology. A low-tax, low-spend Ireland is what we have. Unfortunately, society costs a certain amount to run, especially in a small jurisdiction where you can't necessarily afford, and you don't have an equal demand on resources all the time. It's more expensive to run things, so there are inherent contradictions in our economic and political model in Jersey, which the current incumbents won't be willing to address because there are too many inconvenient questions that come up. Of course, you have to, if a minister for health or for education, for example, wanted to question the system, they would have to question the fundamental economic wisdom of our ultimate leaders, and they're not willing to do that.
When I interviewed Judy Martin when she first became an assistant minister, she was full of enthusiasm, the things she was going to do, the Convention on the Rights was going to be implemented, all sorts of things, and they haven't happened. I mean, in any system, she surely ought to be sacked, didn't she?
I couldn't comment on that. I don't know enough about what her responsibilities have been and to what extent she's discharged her duties correctly or not. But
it's not enough to be well-meaning, is it? She's obviously genuine, sincere, well-meaning, but obviously when it comes to the crunch, she can't attract the resources, can't she?
I suspect I know Judy, let's say on a friendly basis, so I'm in a slightly delicate position. What I would say is that I think you're dealing with realpolitik when you become a minister or an assistant minister, and it's very difficult for somebody who actually wants to get things done. I mean, talk is cheap, I think, in Jersey, anywhere, but actually to have it comes down to funding again, if we're to be honest. If the funds aren't there, and if you can't actually make the case for extra funding in a time when the ministers, the Treasury and the Chief Minister and the whole entourage at the top are actually hell-bent on making ideological cuts for the sake of it, the rest of it's pretty academic.
So finally, on Holocaust Day, rights don't mean a lot in Jersey.
I think rights as an abstract concept is something that everyone can sign up to, but under our system it's perhaps much more difficult, as I've said, when there's a lack of will, perhaps, and a lack of resource being directed in a certain direction to actually make sure that those fundamental human rights are actually meaningful.
We'll leave it there. Thanks a lot.